Usually when we talk about a crisis, there is this expectation of, well, absolute precision.
Right, like an engineering disaster.
Yeah, exactly, like engineering.
Yeah.
A massive suspension bridge suddenly collapses into a river, right? And the investigators show up.
And they pull the wreckage apart.
They pull it all apart, and they find this rusted, microscopic stress fracture on a primary steel beam. And the lead engineer just points at it with a flashlight and says, there it is. That is exactly why it fell.
Right, it's binary. It is a structural failure. I mean, it is entirely measurable, it's clean, and most importantly, it's governed by the laws of physics. Gravity really doesn't care about your feelings.
Broken or not broken.
Yeah.
And honestly, there's something deeply comforting about that,
Absolutely.
We as humans, we like things to be visible. We like them to be cleanly categorized. We want to know exactly why the roof caved in so we could just replace the beam and, go back to sleep.
Sure, we want a simple fix.
But then you step into the world of sociology. You step into cultural shifts, massive demographic changes, and, well, civilizational decline. And suddenly, that structural X-ray machine we rely on is completely broken.
Yeah, it doesn't work at all.
We are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is, let's be real here, incredibly murky. We are essentially trying to measure wind with a ruler.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. When a society starts fracturing, there is rarely a single rusted beam you can just point to.
Right.
It's a million microscopic fractures happening simultaneously across our institutions, across families, and honestly, across individual psychologies.
Exactly. And that is exactly what we are attempting to X-ray today for you. Today's mission is a massive, incisive, incredibly detailed unpack of a brand new, highly provocative 2025 ebook that is currently making serious waves.
These huge words.
It's called The Great Political Ideologies, How Utopian Visions Cause Catastrophes by Conrad Riker. Now, before we jump into the deep end here, I need you to do us a huge favor.
Please do.
If you are listening to this right now, whether you're on your commute, at the gym, or just hanging around the house, hit that like and subscribe button on whatever app you're using. It is the absolute best way to support this deep dive and ensure we can keep bringing you these massive, unfiltered reviews of the most fascinating ideas out there.
And we definitely have a fascinating and, well, highly volatile one today.
Oh, volatile is the word. Now, I want to be entirely upfront with you, the listener, about what we are looking at today. If you are someone who aligns with the men's rights activist movement, if you follow the red pill manosphere, or if you are just insanely curious about understanding the history of our institutions before they were, as the author explicitly puts it, captured by feminists and Marxists, then this book was tailor-made for you.
It really is. It is a dense, aggressive architectural blueprint of that exact worldview.
Yep. If this deep dive sounds like your kind of read, you need to check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy it. And definitely go follow at Conrad Riker at Substack and Twitter.
But before we even open the cover of this text, we absolutely must establish the ground rules for today's discussion. I mean, this is crucial for how we proceed.
Extremely crucial. The source material we are unpacking today is highly politically charged. It touches on the absolute most volatile left-wing and right-wing cultural flashpoints of our current era.
Everything from gender and education to corporate structure and marriage.
Yeah. So let us state clearly, for the record, we are absolutely not taking sides here. We're not endorsing the viewpoints of the author, Conrad Riker, nor are we condemning them.
Right. Our mission today is strict, unwavering impartiality. We are here to report, unpack, and analyze the ideas contained in Riker's original source material. We want to help you understand the architecture of this specific worldview.
We want to look at the blueprints of his argument to see, how it's constructed, how the load-bearing walls of his philosophy function, and why it is resonating so deeply with a massive cohort of modern men.
Precisely. We are the tour guides today, not the judges.
So let's lay out the roadmap. At a 30,000-foot view, what is Riker actually arguing in the great political ideologies?
So the overarching thesis of the book draws these aggressive, unblinking historical parallels between the devastating 20th century Marxist catastrophes and 21st century progressive policies.
Okay, so connecting the past to the present.
Exactly. Riker's fundamental argument is built on a specific equation whenever a society ignores biological and economic reality in favor of, quote, utopian visions, that society inevitably collapses.
So he believes that ignoring human nature and physical limits just to appease an ideology is the historical precursor to mass suffering.
Yeah. The architecture of his argument hinges on looking at past disasters to predict future ones, and he starts this argument by looking at famine.
Right. He goes straight to the Holodomor in the Soviet Union and Mao's great leap forward in China.
Yes. And to understand Riker's book, you really have to understand the specific historical concept he uses to bridge the past and the present. It's called Lysenkoism.
Okay, let's slow down and really define this, because he leans on this term heavily throughout the entire book. Who was Lysenko, and what exactly is Lysenkoism?
So, Trofim Lysenko was a Soviet agronomist. He rose to immense power under Joseph Stalin in the 1930s. At the time, the global scientific consensus was built around Mendelian genetics, the idea that traits are inherited through genes, which are hardwired.
Right, basic biology.
But Lysenko rejected genetics entirely. He believed that Mendelian genetics were a bourgeois, capitalist, Western concept because they implied that inequality was built right into nature.
Wow, okay, so what did he replace it with?
He believed that traits acquired by a plant or an organism during its lifetime could actually be inherited by its offspring.
Wait, really?
Yeah. He thought that if you took winter wheat seeds and soaked them in freezing water, you would basically train the seeds to survive the Russian winter. He genuinely believed that environment and communal effort could completely conquer inherent genetic nature.
That's wild. It was Marxist ideology applied directly to biology.
Exactly. And because if you can rewrite the biology of a wheat seed just by changing its environment, then you can rewrite the biology and psychology of a human being by putting them in a Marxist utopia.
It was perfectly aligned with Stalin's political goals.
Yes. And because Stalin loved this ideologically pure pseudoscience, he made it official state policy. Any traditional scientist who argued for standard genetics was fired, imprisoned, or executed.
And a practical result of implementing this pure ideology was the Holodomor.
Yeah, it was a disaster. Stalin forced these Marxist agricultural policies on the Ukrainian farmers, known as the kulaks. The state confiscated their seed grain, punished the pragmatic farmers who actually knew how to grow food, and rigidly enforced Lysenko's delusions.
Just a total denial of reality.
The result was a catastrophic man-made famine. Between 1932 and 1933, an estimated 3.9 million Ukrainians starved to death.
Unbelievable.
And Riker points out that Mao Zedong adopted similar utopian policies decades later during the Great Leap Forward. Mao literally had peasants melting down their essential farming plows in backyard furnaces just to meet arbitrary state steel quotas.
The outcome being that millions more starved to death because they destroyed their agricultural tools for an ideological metric.
Right.
And this is where Riker makes a massive, aggressive leap. He takes that 20th century history of Soviet and Chinese starvation and he maps it directly onto today. He calls modern environmental policies climate Lysenkoism.
Riker argues that today's climate activists and international bureaucrats are making the exact same fundamental mistake. They are prioritizing a utopian vision of a carbon-free world over the gritty physical realities of how human beings actually sustain themselves.
Okay, so what's his prime example? How does he illustrate the mechanics of this?
The main one he uses is the 2022 Sri Lankan agricultural collapse.
Oh, this is a perfect example to unpack. What exactly happened in Sri Lanka, according to Riker's analysis?
So in April 2021, the president of Sri Lanka, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, essentially banned all synthetic fertilizers and pesticides nationwide, virtually overnight.
So completely overnight.
Yeah. The stated goal was to make Sri Lanka the world's first 100% organic farming nation. Now, Riker argues that this wasn't done because of some sudden localized agronomic breakthrough. It was done largely to appease international environmental standards and boost the country's ESG scores.
Okay, and for those listening who might not follow corporate finance, ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. It's basically a corporate and sovereign social credit score that heavily dictates whether international banks and institutions will give you favorable funding and loans.
Exactly. And Riker's point is that the transition from chemical fertilizer to organic farming is incredibly slow. It takes years, sometimes a decade, to rebuild the soil microbiology necessary to sustain crop yields organically. You cannot just flip a switch.
But the ideologues pushing the policy ignored the agronomic reality.
Yep. And the result was terrifying. Riker notes that within months, domestic rice yields in Sri Lanka crashed by 50%.
Wow, 50%.
The country, which had been completely self-sufficient in rice production, suddenly had to import hundreds of millions of dollars worth of rice. Even worse, their tea plantations, which were their primary export, and a $1.3 billion industry just completely collapsed.
People were suddenly foraging for wild yams in a country that literally a year prior had plenty of food.
Yeah. The economic shock led to massive riots, hyperinflation, and the president actually fleeing the country. Riker is looking at this exact scenario and saying, look at the mechanics here. The ideologues have changed their lab coats for Patagonia vests and corporate lanyards, but they are still starving people by denying physical reality.
He takes this critique even further, pointing the finger directly at the European Union. He notes that EU bureaucrats are currently pushing massive continent-wide organic farming targets for 2030. But Riker highlights the devastating ripple effects in places like Africa.
Right, he cites instances of Kenyan farmers literally smuggling modern synthetic fertilizers in coffins.
Like coffins.
Yes,
Yeah.
just to bypass EU-funded organic mandates so they can actually grow enough food to feed their local populations.
That is a stark image. And this is where Riker establishes one of the core dichotomies of his worldview. He draws a razor-sharp contrast between what he calls desk jockey bureaucrats, the people who deal in theories, spreadsheets, and optics, and the people who actually deal with physical reality to sustain civilization.
And he illustrates this beautifully, or brutally, depending on your perspective, with a contrast between modern Green Party politicians and a guy named Frank Zybach.
Oh, talk about this comparison because it really anchors his definition of masculinity.
Riker brings up a former Green Party agriculture minister in Germany. He describes this minister, somewhat mockingly, as a guy who eats moss for breakfast.
That's for breakfast, right?
Riker highlights an initiative where this minister tried to ban all meat in Berlin public schools to fight climate change, and the result. According to Riker, it just led to an underground black market for bratwurst run by 12-year-olds on the playground.
That's hilarious.
Riker uses this to mock the absurdity of trying to legislate against human appetite.
And then he holds up Frank Zybach as the antithesis to that bureaucrat. Who is Zybach?
Frank Zybach was an American mechanic and farmer in the mid-20th century. He is the man who invented center pivot irrigation.
Oh, you mean when you fly over the American Midwest and you see all those massive, perfect green circles of crops?
That's Zybach's invention. He wasn't a theoretician. He wasn't sitting in a university lounge debating policy. He was a guy with dirty hands, scrap metal, and a deep, intuitive understanding of hydraulics and physical reality.
So Riker uses Zybach as the ultimate archetype.
Yeah, he argues that gritty, hands-on, unapologetic masculinity is what actually builds the infrastructure that feeds the world, while academic theory merely regulates it to the point of starvation.
Okay, let's unpack this. I need to push back on Riker's framing here. The host of A Deep Dive has to ask the hard question.
Go for it.
Riker is comparing modern environmental policies, which most people would argue are driven by a genuine, desperate desire to stop catastrophic climate change, directly to Joseph Stalin's death tolls. How does he bridge the massive gap between what most people view as a well-meaning, if flawed, green policy and malicious, authoritarian totalitarianism?
That is a pivotal question. And Riker's answer is that the intent is completely irrelevant.
Really?
This is a core pillar of his philosophy. Whether you are trying to usher in a workers' paradise for the proletariat or you are trying to save the planet from carbon emissions, the poison is the exact same. The mechanism of destruction is the denial of reality.
So the outcome is what matters.
Riker argues that whenever you place a utopian vision above the messy, pragmatic laws of biology, physics, supply chains, and human nature, the outcome is always going to be catastrophic. The road to Sri Lankan starvation was paved with very good ESG intentions.
So to Riker, intent doesn't absolve you of the consequences of denying reality. And he argues that this fundamental denial of reality isn't just happening out in the agricultural fields, it's happening at the very root of human development. It starts in the classroom.
Which brings us to the next major section of the book, the education crisis, and what Riker explicitly and unapologetically labels the war on boys.
If we accept Riker's premise that biological realities are being systematically denied by modern institutions, how does he apply that to a second-grade classroom?
Riker's thesis here is that modern progressive education systems have been fundamentally redesigned to punish natural masculine traits and reward feminine obedience.
Interesting.
He believes this ideological shift is causing a catastrophic global failure of boys.
The statistics he brings to the table to back this up are pretty staggering. He cites data showing that globally, boys lag 1.5 grades behind girls in reading proficiency. And then he zeroes in on Finland.
Right. If you follow education policy, you know Finland is almost universally held up as the progressive, egalitarian educational utopia.
Right, no homework, all that stuff.
They focus on play, they minimize standardized testing, they emphasize emotional intelligence. But Riker points out a massive, glaring flaw in the data. In Finland, the reading gap between genders balloons to 2.3 grades.
Wow.
Boys are 2.3 grades behind girls in the supposedly perfect system.
And this is where Riker's focus on biology comes back. His explanation for this gap isn't that boys are somehow intellectually defective or lazy. His argument is evolutionary.
Yeah, he states that male brains evolved over hundreds of thousands of years for spatial puzzles, for risk-taking, for physical movement, and for navigating strict hierarchies through competition.
They did not evolve to sit perfectly still under fluorescent lights for 8 hours, journaling feelings in a beanbag circle, as he derisively puts it.
Exactly. He argues that the modern classroom doesn't just fail to accommodate boyhood, it actively pathologizes it.
It treats it like a sickness.
It treats high energy, competitiveness, and physical aggression as a disease that needs to be medicated or corrected rather than a natural biological drive that needs to be harnessed and directed.
It's like we are trying to treat boyhood like a software bug instead of recognizing it as the operating system. And to illustrate how dangerous this ideological leveling is, Riker uses a very vivid firefighting analogy. Break this down because it perfectly captures his view on dropping objective standards.
Riker argues that in an attempt to achieve ideological equality or equal representation, institutions will inevitably lower their physical or objective standards.
Right.
He points to ongoing controversies in major cities regarding the push to lower physical standards in firefighting academies so that a higher percentage of female applicants can pass the tests.
And his counterargument to that,
His counterargument is brutally pragmatic. Fire does not care about diversity quotas. A burning roof truss doesn't care about the gender of the person underneath it. It just weighs what it weighs.
when the roof is collapsing, you don't need ideological theater. You need biological strength to carry a 200-pound unconscious victim down a flight of stairs.
Exactly. And Riker takes that logic that reality will eventually expose lowered standards and applies it back to the classroom. He argues that by stripping out competition and physical risk to make classrooms more inclusive and emotionally safe, we are fundamentally failing to educate the male demographic.
But he doesn't just point at the problem and complain, right? Riker highlights what happens when you actually reintroduce traditional, unabashed masculinity to the learning environment. He talks about an experiment in Alabama.
Yes, he cites a school district in Alabama that experimented with boys-only math leagues. They completely changed the environment. Instead of a cooperative, mixed-gender setting where boys were expected to sit quietly, they turned math into a highly competitive, male-only arena.
It was loud, it was zero-sum, there were winners and losers.
And the result?
That's it.
These boys outscored the mixed-gender control classes by a massive 35%.
The dopamine hit of a hierarchy. The evolutionary drive to secure status among peers. Riker argues that when you tap into that, male performance just skyrockets.
He also mentions a vocational program that offered shop class scholarships. When they aggressively funded hands-on mechanical learning, male enrollment absolutely exploded by 300%.
And the fascinating byproduct, their standardized STEM test scores math and science went up by 18%.
It turns out, as Riker says, boys learn physics and calculus a lot faster when it is applied to the torque specs on a '68 Mustang engine block, rather than abstracted on a whiteboard.
Okay, I understand the mechanics of his argument here, but again, I have to play devil's advocate.
Of course.
It sounds like Riker is saying we're treating boyhood like a disease to be cured, rather than a development stage to be channeled. But how does he explain the very legitimate counter-argument that schools are just trying to reduce bullying, reduce physical violence, and create safer environments for everyone? Isn't suppressing that aggression a requirement for a polite society?
If we connect this back to his larger philosophy regarding human nature, Riker argues that you simply cannot delete biological drives. You cannot just erase healthy aggression through zero-tolerance policies.
Okay, so where does it go?
If you suppress it in structured environments like schools, you don't eliminate it, you just create a vacuum. And what fills that vacuum? Riker argues it's gang culture.
The dark side of unstructured masculinity.
Exactly. He cites a terrifying statistic from the Chicago Police Department in 2022. 73% of teenage gang recruits in the city grew up without a father in the home.
Wow, 73%.
Riker argues these kids aren't joining gangs because they are inherently evil or sociopathic. They're joining gangs because the gang offers the exact things their biology is screaming for, which the school system has denied them.
Which is what?
clear male mentorship, rites of passage, physical risk, and a strict, understandable hierarchy. Riker's thesis is that by stripping schools and society of healthy, structured masculine initiation, we are effectively handing our most vulnerable youth over to the streets.
We removed the basketball coach and the shop teacher, and the gang leader stepped into the void.
Yeah.
That is a heavy, sobering analysis of the sociology at play. And it acts as a perfect, if dark, transition into what is undoubtedly the most controversial chapter of the entire book. This brings us to what Riker calls medical Lysenkoism and the gender-industrial complex.
This is where Riker takes his metaphor of the Soviet denial of genetics, Lysenko soaking the wheat seeds in ice water, and applies it directly to the modern medical transition of minors.
Yeah.
He doesn't hold back here.
He really doesn't.
He literally calls the current protocols Maoist struggle session cosplay.
It's a brutal description, and he brings a mountain of medical data to bear on this argument. He starts with the DSM-5, which is the standard classification of mental disorders used by mental health professionals in the United States.
Yep.
He points out that according to the DSM's own data, roughly 80% of childhood gender dysphoria resolves naturally by adulthood without any medical intervention, provided the child is allowed to just go through natural puberty.
He uses that baseline statistic to argue that aggressive early medical intervention is fundamentally anti-scientific. He pairs that with a 2021 study out of Johns Hopkins University, which he says confirms that youth transitions provide no long-term mental health benefits.
And he also heavily highlights a 2024 Mayo Clinic study that found an alarming 40% of youths using cross-sex hormones develop significant cardiac issues.
Let's dig into the mechanism of his argument here. Riker isn't just saying the doctors are wrong, he is saying they are captured.
Captured by ideology.
His argument is that the medical establishment is intentionally ignoring its own data, its own long-term studies, to appease ideological activists. He illustrates this by doing a deep dive into the Tavistock Clinic meltdown in the United Kingdom.
The Tavistock Clinic was the UK's only dedicated gender identity clinic for children and young people, right?
Right. For years, it was held up as the gold standard for gender-affirming care. But it was eventually shut down by the UK government after massive internal whistleblowing and independent reviews revealed severe safeguarding failures.
Riker focuses heavily on the lawsuit brought by Kira Bell. For our listeners who don't know, Kira Bell is a detransitioner. She was a teenager struggling with severe mental health issues when she went to Tavistock.
And what happened?
She successfully sued the clinic, arguing that they rushed her onto puberty blockers and testosterone after only a handful of superficial consultations. And that led to irreversible bodily changes that she deeply regretted as a young adult.
Right. And Riker views the Kira Bell case not as an anomaly, but as the inevitable result of an ideological system. He argues that confused, vulnerable teenagers are essentially being used as lab rats by what he aggressively terms gender grifters. He views the entire protocol as a massive violation of medical ethics.
He doesn't just critique it, he offers a very concrete, hardline policy solution in the book. He advocates for a mandatory age 25 minimum for any irreversible gender procedures, or at the very absolute minimum, a 10-year waiting period.
His logic is aggressively straightforward.
Yeah. If society deems a 19-year-old too immature to buy a beer, and a 24-year-old too financially reckless to rent a car without a massive surcharge, then an adolescent absolutely does not have the cognitive capacity to permanently alter their endocrine system or undergo irreversible surgeries.
But here is where Riker's analysis gets deeply psychological. He introduces a concept to explain why the medical and activist communities refuse to back down, even when presented with data like the Tavistock closure. He calls the entire gender-industrial complex a massive sunk cost fallacy.
Right. I wanted to ask about this. Riker uses the term sunk cost fallacy to describe this complex. What exactly does he mean by that? I mean, I know it from economics and gambling, the idea that you keep pouring money into a losing hand because you've already bet so much. But how does he map that onto psychology?
Well, this raises a profoundly important question about human psychology and cognitive dissonance. The sunk cost fallacy, as you said, is continuing a behavior because of previously invested resources. Riker's theory is that once individuals and even entire medical institutions have spent upwards of $300,000 on surgeries, years of synthetic hormones, and the immense social capital required to publicly transition, the psychological cost of admitting regret is simply too high for the human ego to bear.
Because to admit a mistake wouldn't just be admitting a minor error, It would require dismantling their entire identity and worldview.
Precisely. If a patient realizes at age 25 that they made a catastrophic mistake at age 16, the grief and cognitive dissonance are unimaginable. So, according to Riker, the human brain protects itself.
By doubling down.
Instead of admitting the mistake, they're psychologically forced to double down. They become evangelical. They aggressively push the ideology onto others, especially children, because the more people who validate their choice by joining them, the less they have to confront the reality of their own irreversible actions.
That is a bleak, incredibly dark perspective on the psychology at play. It posits that the loudest activists are actually the ones suffering from the most profound internal doubt.
Yeah, it's pretty heavy.
And this idea of biological reality eventually catching up with ideology bleeds right into his next major theme. He titles this section Darwin's Comeback, focusing heavily on sports, human biology, and what he terms the estrogen effect.
If the medical chapter was about the internal psychological denial of biology, this chapter is about the external physical collision of ideology and reality. Riker is laser-focused on the intrusion of biological men into women's sports.
Which is a huge topic right now.
Oh, massive. To him, this isn't just a niche cultural wedge issue. It is the ultimate undeniable proof that you cannot legislate away evolutionary biology.
You can write all the inclusive policies you want, but bone density is bone density.
Exactly. He brings the receipts on this. He cites a 2021 study from the British Journal of Sports Medicine, which analyzed the physical differences between biological males and females. The study showed that even after years of testosterone suppression, female concussion risks literally double when they are forced to compete against trans-identified biological males in contact sports.
Riker also brings up data from MIT, confirming that athletes with XY chromosomes have, on average, a 12% faster physical reaction time.
Right.
Which might not sound like a lot if you're jogging, but in a combat sport like mixed martial arts, a 12% faster twitch reflex is basically the difference between slipping a punch and getting a fractured orbital bone.
Yeah.
It's a massive, insurmountable biological advantage.
Riker uses some very vivid, almost cinematic examples to illustrate the absurdity of denying this physical reality. He talks about a vegan TikToker who goes by the handle Broccoli Head.
Oh, I've seen this.
This influencer went viral for live streaming a heavy deadlift attempt after fasting and drinking a kale smoothie, and he completely collapsed, passing out on camera. Riker uses this anecdote to mock the modern delusion that you can fight human physiology and the need for dense protein with plant-based idealism. He views it as physical weakness masquerading as moral superiority.
And on the flip side of that weakness, he shows what happens when regular people finally get exhausted by the ideological debate and just demand reality. He talks about a youth soccer league in Texas.
This is a fascinating sociological data point. This Texas league accidentally sold out its tournament registrations in 24 hours.
Why?
Because amidst all the national controversy over inclusion, they simply mandated an XX chromosome check for the female brackets. They promised a biologically segregated tournament. And the parents, who were exhausted by the inclusion debate and worried about their daughters getting injured by biologically male players, just voted with their wallets. They flocked to the league that acknowledged reality.
But Riker doesn't just blame external progressive policies for the decline in male vitality. He turns the mirror on the modern man himself. He attributes a lot of the modern male malaise, the lethargy, the depression, the lack of ambition, to what he calls the estrogen echo chamber.
Riker looks at the biochemical shift in modern men. He points to diets heavy in soy and microplastics, which many studies link to lowered testosterone and endocrine disruption.
Right, the physical environment.
But more prominently, he points to the pharmaceutical pacification of men. He cites CDC data showing that roughly 40% of American men over the age of 35 are now taking SSRI antidepressants.
40%. That is a staggering number of men whose neurochemistry is being chemically flattened.
Riker contrasts this mass chemical pacification with another exploding medical trend, the booming $5 billion market for testosterone optimization clinics. You see these clinics popping up in every strip mall in America.
Yeah, they are everywhere.
Riker's interpretation is that men intuitively know they have been chemically and culturally neutered. They're desperately trying to buy back the biological drive, the edge that modern diets, sedentary lifestyles, and SSRI prescriptions have stripped away from them.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Riker points out a supreme, almost Shakespearean irony in all of this culture war stuff. He notes the loudest voices currently protesting the inclusion of biological men in female sports, or the invasion of biological men into female STEM grants and corporate board quotas, are often the very same legacy feminist groups who spent the last 40 years writing those exact inclusivity policies.
Right. They fought for the complete deconstruction of gender boundaries, and now they are horrified that biological men are walking through the doors they unlocked.
Feminist groups are now protesting the very inclusivity policies they helped write. It's the ultimate ideological snake eating its own tail, the revolution consuming its creators. So how does Riker advise his readers to handle this? Does he want them to ally with the feminists to protect women's sports?
Absolutely not. This is where Riker's strategic ruthlessness comes out. He advises what he calls the Matt Walsh approach. The strategy is not to argue with the progressive logic, and certainly not to act as a white knight to save feminists from the consequences of their own policies.
So what is the play then?
Riker's advice is accelerationism. You take those progressive ideas to their absolute logical extreme until they break under their own weight.
Explain the mechanics of that. How does accelerationism work in this context?
If the institutional premise is that trans women are women, Riker says you shouldn't argue the biology. You should push for total, unmitigated inclusion. Push for it until biological females are completely displaced from every podium, every scholarship, and every board seat.
Wow, just accelerate it all.
Riker's logic is that the system will never self-correct based on a logical argument. It will only correct when the pain of the policy becomes unbearable. Force the system to confront the biological reality it tried to legislate away by letting the ideology consume itself entirely.
Let it consume itself. Wow. It's a strategy of total withdrawal of male protection. Which is a perfect segue, because we need to shift our focus now.
Yeah.
Riker takes this concept of men withdrawing their protection from a system that hates them and applies it to the most fundamental institution of human history, marriage. This brings us to the marriage strike and what he calls the gynocracy trap.
If the previous sections were about biology and culture, this section is a stark, cold-blooded financial and legal warning to men. Riker does not view modern state-sanctioned marriage as a romantic partnership or a spiritual union.
He looks at it purely as a contract.
He analyzes it purely as a high-risk legal liability where the man holds virtually all the downside risk. He calculates the average divorce for a middle-class earner as a potential $72,000 a year alimony and asset loss risk.
He looks at the modern family court system and basically says, why would any rational actor sign this contract? And the data he pulls shows that men are increasingly agreeing with him. Pew Research shows that 45% of American men under the age of 40 are now refusing to marry entirely.
And this is a crucial distinction in Riker's rhetoric. The mainstream media often frames this decline in marriage as men suffering from Peter Pan syndrome. They are lazy, they want to play video games, they are afraid of commitment.
Right, the usual narrative.
Riker completely rejects that framing. He frames the marriage strike as a highly rational market withdrawal from a system that is legally rigged against them. He introduces a brilliant economic analogy here. He calls it sperm capital flight.
Let me unpack that analogy because it's vital. In economics, capital flight is when investors pull all their money out of a country because the government starts seizing assets or raising taxes to confiscatory levels.
Yep.
Riker is saying that men are looking at the family courts where women initiate nearly 70% of divorces and overwhelmingly win custody and alimony, and men are simply taking their genetic and financial capital and leaving the market. They are taking their chips off the table.
He backs up this dry economic theory with some truly infuriating and tragic human anecdotes. These stories are the emotional core of this chapter. He talks about Dave, a 42-year-old master electrician.
Oh, this story was tough.
Dave worked 60-hour weeks for a decade to provide for his family. His wife gets bored, files for no-fault divorce. And because of how the state calculates assets and future earnings, Dave is now living out of his Honda Civic while his ex-wife got the house, the dog, and as Riker bitterly notes, Dave's vintage Millennium Falcon collection in the asset split.
It's the total unspooling of a man's life's work. And then there is the incredibly dark, tragic story of Jonathan Ladd. Ladd was a Marine veteran who survived combat deployments, came home, got married, and eventually divorced.
And then the economy crashed.
He lost his job during an economic downturn. But the family court doesn't care about the economy. They refuse to lower his child support payments. Facing imminent jail time for falling into arrears on payments he mathematically could not afford, Jonathan Ladd ended up taking his own life inside a rented storage unit.
Riker uses Jonathan Ladd's tragedy to indict the entire legal structure. He argues that family courts view men not as human beings who can experience hardship, but merely as walking biological ATMs. And if the ATM stops dispensing cash, the state locks it in a cage.
And on the slightly more eccentric, yet still desperate side, he mentions a man in Texas who went to extreme lengths to escape the system.
This guy is unbelievable.
This guy built a 98 square foot totally off-grid shack deep in the woods. And he built the shack shaped like Andre the Giant's fist.
Wait, shaped like a giant fist?
Literally shaped like a fist. He lives out there with solar panels and a 3D printed drone jammer just to legally dodge paying alimony to an ex-wife who cheated on him. Riker uses these stories to show that men are being backed into corners and they are choosing radical, sometimes fatal, sometimes bizarre forms of exit.
It really paints a picture of desperation.
But if I'm a listener digesting this, I have to ask, if men are going on a mass strike, what is Riker's actual alternative? Does he just want a generation of men to be totally alone? To just sit in the woods in fist-shaped shacks by themselves? That sounds like a different kind of dystopia.
Not at all. Riker doesn't advocate for isolation. He advocates for strategic independence. He explores the MGTOW movement, men going their own way. He discusses a lifestyle choice called monk mode, where men completely and intentionally withdraw from the modern dating market for a period of time to focus entirely on building their wealth, their physical health, and their independent skills, free from the distractions and liabilities of modern dating.
But for those who do eventually want to partner up and have a family because biological drives still exist, what is his solution?
For those men, he advocates for radical legal separation from the state. He talks about concepts like blockchain-enforced prenuptial agreements or creating private trusts that hold all assets, bypassing state family courts entirely.
Keep the state out of it.
His overarching advice is that men must protect their assets and their future with the exact same ruthlessness and legal fortification that a multinational corporation would use to protect its patents. You do not invite the state into your bedroom or your bank account.
And this idea of quietly withdrawing from hostile systems, of building armor around yourself, brings us right into Section 6, the feminist gulag and the substack samizdat. Having dismantled education and marriage, Riker now turns his sights on the corporate world, specifically HR departments and cancel culture.
Riker draws a direct, unyielding line between modern corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion training and Soviet re-education camps.
DEI equals Soviet gulags to him.
He doesn't see DEI as a clumsy corporate attempt at fairness. He sees it as an ideological purity test designed to enforce submission. He highlights a massive Cato Institute study showing that 40% of Americans now actively self-censor their political and social views at work for fear of retaliation.
40%.
Riker jokes very darkly that the average American office worker fears the HR department more than they fear gingivitis or a heart attack.
He gives a chilling example of how this ideological policing works in academia, looking at the case of Professor Harold Weiss at UC Berkeley. Professor Weiss, a tenured academic, allegedly got fired just for quoting the philosopher Thomas Hobbes' famous book, Leviathan, during a lecture.
A classic text.
He quoted the classic line that life in the state of nature is nasty, prudish, and short. And the administration reportedly deemed that, quote, an expression of toxic masculinity that made students feel unsafe, and they fired him.
It perfectly illustrates Riker's point about the denial of reality. A professor is fired for teaching classical philosophy because it violates the utopian requirement that all spaces must be emotionally comfortable.
So if you are a young man entering the corporate workforce, how do you survive in this environment? How do you avoid the HR gulag without starving to death? Riker explains a tactic that Gen Z men are increasingly using. He calls it gray mirroring.
Gray mirroring is a fascinating sociological adaptation. It's essentially malicious compliance. Riker describes how young men will fake absolute, enthusiastic agreement with the woke rules in public. They will nod along in the DEI meetings, put their pronouns in their email signatures, and applaud the corporate synergy.
But privately.
Privately, they're building alternative, unfiltered networks and actively working against the ideological goals of the company.
It's corporate camouflage. It's like a soldier wearing jungle fatigues. You aren't wearing the uniform because you love the jungle. You're wearing it so the predator, in this case the HR department, doesn't see you while you quietly dig your trench and prepare for a completely different kind of war.
Exactly. And the communication network for this underground movement is what Riker calls the modern samizdat.
We need to define that term for listeners who aren't Cold War historians. What is a samizdat?
During the Soviet era, the Kremlin strictly controlled all media and publishing. If a dissident wanted to share an illegal essay, they couldn't just print it. So individuals would literally retype manuscripts using carbon paper, creating a few copies at a time, and pass them secretly from hand to hand.
Wow, just passing them around manually.
This underground, decentralized network of self-published literature was called samizdat. It was how truth survived under total censorship.
And Riker compares modern independent platforms like Substack, Rumble, and private encrypted Telegram servers to the Soviet samizdat. They are underground networks where men are bypassing the algorithmic censorship of Silicon Valley and the legacy media.
Yeah.
Silicon Valley thought deplatforming Alex Jones would silence him. How does Riker view deplatforming? I mean, a few years ago, the prevailing wisdom was that if you coordinated the banning of someone across every major app in a single day, you just cut off their oxygen. That would be the end of it.
What's fascinating here is Riker's argument that censorship is actually the greatest catalyst for the parallel economy. He views deplatforming not as a victory for the establishment, but as a massive, fatal strategic error.
So,
In his view, banning someone doesn't erase their ideas, it just mints a martyr. When you kick millions of disaffected men off mainstream platforms like Twitter or YouTube, you don't change their minds. You simply force them to go build their own infrastructure.
push them out of the city so they go build a fortress in the hills?
Precisely. Censorship accelerates the creation of the very parallel economies, new payment processors, new video hosts, new server farms that eventually threaten the mainstream monopoly. The establishment accidentally funded their own competition.
Which perfectly sets up Section 7, the heroic imperative, and the daddy state. This is where Riker really digs deep into the philosophical contrast between male sacrifice and what he views as female institutional capture.
Riker asserts a foundational, deeply traditional belief in this chapter. Civilizations are built, maintained, and ultimately protected by male sacrifice. He points to the stark, bloody reality of history. He notes that 73% of Allied casualties on D-Day were men.
He argues that the grim, dirty, lethal jobs that keep the lights on, the sewers running, and the borders secure, the oil rig workers, the high-voltage linemen, the infantry, are overwhelmingly done by men.
He argues that male disposability is the engine of civilization, and he contrasts that historical, bloody sacrifice with a concept he brilliantly coins, the Medusa effect.
The Medusa effect. Okay, walk me through the mechanics of this Medusa effect. I know Riker is theorizing on the life cycle of institutions here.
Yeah, he argues that men build institutions like the military or a tech startup or a university based on ruthless pragmatism and binary outcomes. Did we win the battle? Did the code work?
Right.
But he argues that when women eventually infiltrate and capture these traditionally male institutions, they inevitably paralyze them. They turn them to stone.
How exactly does female infiltration paralyze an institution in Riker's view? What is the how?
Riker argues that the paralysis happens through the introduction of bureaucratic empathy.
Bureaucratic empathy.
Yes. When a male institution is focused on a dangerous external objective, the metric for success is purely the outcome. But when bureaucratic empathy is introduced, the metric for success shifts from the outcome to the process. It becomes about how people felt while doing the job.
Oh, I see.
Are their ranks diverse? Is the language inclusive? Are we fostering psychological safety? Riker's thesis is that once an institution prioritizes the emotional comfort of its members over the ruthlessness of its primary objective, it loses its ability to survive a crisis. It becomes paralyzed by its own safety protocols.
He critiques the massive, glaring hypocrisy of the modern progressive movement regarding this, too. He points out the relentless demand for 50-50 equal representation in comfortable, air-conditioned corporate boardrooms or in STEM grants.
Right, but what about the dirty jobs?
Exactly. He notes the absolute deafening silence when it comes to demanding gender parity in battlefield deaths, commercial fishing fatalities, or raw homelessness. He points out that 80% of the unsheltered homeless population in America are men, which he poetically calls human tumbleweeds, blown away by a society that only values men for their utility and discards them when they break.
He provides a striking visual contrast to drive this point home. He juxtaposes a modern news story about a female Ukrainian member of parliament. This MP was demanding gender-neutral, inclusive language be used in military conscription documents, all while giving the interview from the safety of a Parisian penthouse.
Wow.
Riker contrasts her bureaucratic obsession with language with the grim reality back in her home district, where biological men are the ones actually in the freezing mud, getting their limbs blown off, digging trenches with shovels to hold the line against Russian tanks.
The ultimate disconnect between utopian theory and physical reality. So, if modern institutions are paralyzed by the Medusa effect, how do we train the next generation of men to survive it? Riker doesn't just complain. He proposes a solution he calls pedagogical decontamination. and he advocates for mandatory MMA mixed martial arts training for all 12-year-old boys.
He does.
Riker proposes something called pedagogical decontamination and mandatory MMA for 12-year-olds. Is this just shock value or a literal policy proposal?
If we connect this back to his larger philosophy on biology and the war on boys, it is a literal, deeply serious proposal. Riker truly believes that you have to replace the modern school's feeling circles with physical grit.
Okay, unpack the philosophy of replacing feeling circles with physical grit.
He believes that forcing young boys to engage in regulated physical combat teaches them the physical boundaries of reality. It teaches them hierarchy, respect for the capabilities of others, and most importantly, how to channel their evolutionary aggression productively.
You learn very quickly in a jiu-jitsu match that your ideology doesn't matter if the other guy knows how to apply a chokehold. The physical reality of the mat overrides your internal monologue.
Exactly. Riker views combat sports as an immunization process. By exposing boys to physical reality and structured violence, he believes he's immunizing them against the feminizing, pathologizing nature of modern HR-driven institutions.
Okay, this immense, sprawling argument all culminates in the final section of the book, The New Masculine Order, Building the Parallel Economy. This is the climactic synthesis of Riker's entire playbook for his audience. This is where he tells them what to do with all this anger.
Yes. The ultimate takeaway from Riker's manifesto is not to vote harder in the next midterm election. He doesn't tell his readers to donate to political campaigns or to try and reform the current system from within.
So what's the plan?
His message is a radical departure from traditional conservatism, stop fighting the old system entirely, and go build a new one.
He points to the famous GameStop short squeeze, orchestrated by the Reddit group Wall Street Bets a few years ago. To Riker, this wasn't just a funny meme stock moment. This was a vital proof of concept. It proved that decentralized, anonymous networks of young men using the internet can coordinate to break the financial models of entrenched, elite institutional power.
He uses that energy to advocate for the creation of what he calls a Bachelor Zion.
Wait, I'm getting stuck on a massive contradiction here. Riker spends the entire book bashing utopian visions as the root of all civilizational collapse. He hates Marxist utopias, he hates green utopias, he hates feminist utopias. But then, his grand solution is building a Bachelor Zion. Isn't he just proposing a right-wing masculine utopian vision to replace the left-wing one? How does he square that circle?
It's a fantastic critique, and if you read the text closely, Riker argues that his Zion is not a utopia. A utopia, by his definition, requires changing or ignoring human nature to function. Riker argues that his Bachelor Zion is actually a biological fortress. It doesn't attempt to rewrite human nature. It aligns with it. It embraces biological differences, hierarchy, and physical reality.
Okay, so it's a fortress, not a utopia. What does this fortress look like?
He paints a very specific, almost sci-fi, hypermasculine picture of this ideal future. He wants men to completely withdraw their financial support, their taxes, and their labor from the mainstream system.
So withdrawing from society.
He envisions fathers homeschooling their kids while physically building 3-story timber tree fortresses that are rigged with off-grid solar panels and Bitcoin mining operations. He talks about neo-tribal enclaves forming in places like Idaho or Wyoming, guarded by AI-programmed drone shepherds where groups of highly skilled men operate in decentralized networks paying zero taxes to the federal government.
It's like a high-tech Amish community for tech bros and mechanics. He even mentions groups of men pooling their cryptocurrency to buy decommissioned oil platforms in international waters to create sovereign, untaxable tech fortresses.
And he argues that this radical return to traditionalism and self-reliance is actually a highly effective, deeply attractive strategy. He cites a viral social experiment on Tinder where men swapped their generic modern dating bios to explicitly state they were seeking a traditional wife, a trad wife.
Oh, wow. And the result?
According to the data he cites, their match rates surged by 90%.
Because even within the progressive dating market, biological attraction to traditional provisions still exists.
Exactly. He also points to macroeconomic policies like the Warsaw Family Card in Poland. This was a policy that gave massive sweeping tax breaks to traditional married couples with children. The result was that it successfully doubled the birth rate in those demographics.
Doubled it.
Yeah. Riker calls traditionalism tough tech. He argues that traditional gender roles and biological realism have survived the rise and fall of countless empires, whereas he believes progressivism is incredibly fragile, highly subsidized, and currently collapsing.
So, just to be crystal clear as we wrap up his thesis, so the ultimate goal isn't a political revolution in Washington. They aren't trying to march on the Capitol, elect a new president, and pass new conservative laws.
Exactly. Riker says it's an exodus, and this raises an important question about the fundamental nature of rebellion. They aren't wandering aimlessly, complaining about the woke mind virus on Twitter. They are purposely, methodically withdrawing.
An exodus.
As he beautifully puts it, they aren't wandering, they are building pyramids in the desert. They are creating parallel structures, their own food supplies, their own financial networks, their own medical communities, so that when the mainstream progressive system inevitably collapses under its own bureaucratic weight and denial of reality, they will be the only ones left standing with the skills and resources to rebuild civilization.
Wow. That is an incredibly potent, sweeping vision. We have covered an immense amount of ground today, from Soviet wheat genetics to AI drone fortresses in Idaho. Let's smoothly bring this deep dive to a close. As a reminder, the book we have been unpacking for the last hour is The Great Political Ideologies: How Utopian Visions Cause Catastrophes by Conrad Riker. If this deep dive resonated with you, if you want to read the raw data, the uncensored historical parallels, and the full architectural blueprint of these arguments for yourself, you need to check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to buy it. And do not forget to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack and Twitter to keep up with his latest essays and dispatches from the parallel economy.
And please, if you appreciated this incredibly thorough, unbiased breakdown of such a complex topic, take a second to like and subscribe to our show.
Yes, once again, like and subscribe on your app right now. It really helps us out and keeps the lights on.
And finally, a quick reminder from our end. Today was an exercise in understanding a specific, highly polarized, and very influential worldview. We want to thank you, the listener, for objectively exploring the architecture of this red pill philosophy with us. We aren't here to tell you what to think or how to vote, but to show you exactly how these arguments are constructed and why they are resonating with millions of men globally.
Absolutely. And that leaves us with one final, incredibly provocative thought for you to mull over as you go about your day. We started this deep dive talking about a burning building and the ruthless physical pragmatism required to put out a fire. So think about this. If Riker's vision comes to pass, and a massive cohort of highly skilled, pragmatic men totally withdraw their labor taxes and protection into these high-tech, off-grid bachelor Zions, what happens to the mainstream society they leave behind? Does the progressive utopia adapt to survive without them, or does it simply collapse under its own bureaucratic weight? Think about that. We'll see you on the next deep dive.